Okie doke.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, Emma.
Hey, how you doing, Lois?
Hey, I'm
Hi,
Kate,
how
by
you
the
doing?
way.
Hey, how are you?
I'm all right, making it through the joys of a pandemic. Okay, I think we're gonna get things started now. Just because I know we have got a few more people who are joining late because there's a slight overrun with a couple of other events that are happening. Also for LGBT History Month, which is always great. UEA likes to put on a good show. But hi to everybody watching. To those of you that have never met me and never been to any of our events before, hi, I'm Kate. I'm the chair of UEA Labour. And we've got this amazing event that we're doing in honour of LGBT History Month, called "God Save the Queens," which I thought was a very good pun on my part. I tried. There was a lot of effort, a lot of time went into that. So we've got two brilliant guests, so I'll let them both introduce themselves. So Lois, do you want to start, and then Emma?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Lois Stone. I guess newly Dr. Lois Stone. I think it's my first event since that became official.
Congratulations.
And my pronouns are they, them, or just to use my name. I have a PhD in archaeology, but my doctoral research examined how UK museums construct the narratives around trans history and how that's influenced by trans narratives in popular culture. And I also developed an LGBT history tour for the National Football Museum.
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
That's my little mini bio.
That's really cool. That's very cool. And then Emma, do you want to jump in now?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Emma Vickers. I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores. My pronouns are she, her. What can I tell you? I'm interested in all kinds of aspects of queer history. I've been teaching it today, actually, but particularly in relation to minorities and the military, public history, oral history, yeah, anything queer, and I'm there basically. I sniff it out.
We've got a sixth sense, you can just feel it in people.
Yeah.
I realised I probably should have said earlier my pronouns are they, them, as well. Sorry, I'm awful at remembering to say these kind of things. But I think we're just going to jump straight into the questions now and just get started. So I think we're going to alternate who goes first. So Emma, if you want to go first for this question, and then we'll swap. How did you become interested and involved in queer history generally?
Oh, it's a really good question. No, I can tell you exactly the genealogy of that. So I was an undergraduate at Lancaster University, and I was on a module called Gender and War, and I was reading really myopic, reductionist accounts of queer involvement in the world wars, and it really pissed me off. And I thought that I wanted to correct that for the kids that came after me, who were desperately looking, in my case, I was desperately looking for a sense of my own identity and my own form and where I sat in the world, and I wasn't finding it in the stuff I was reading. Just really badly written literature. So I thought, I'm going to do something about it in the way that you do when you're, 21? Well, I was 18 at that point, but I was 21 when I started my PhD, 22. But yeah, you have that kind of sense of you want to set the world right. So that's why I started. Yeah.
We love that utopianism. It's what we're here for.
Yeah.
We've got to strive, and I think what you've picked up on there is really kind of an important thing that's often overlooked about how, often in terms of representation, people talk about queer representation within the media and within sort of the contemporary sphere, but don't actually kind of give it that historical depth, which kind of gives it that often that real sense of validation rather than just feeling like sort of tokenism. So I think that's a real, I can definitely relate to that. Lois, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I started looking into sort of specifically queer stuff as part of my master's research. So I obviously come through archaeology, which is not as, shall we say, up to date as other fields, maybe, in sort of queer issues, but I was really interested in space and use of space, and how sort of different groups move through areas. And so my master's research was looking at using community mapping practices to identify heritage areas of Manchester, which was very new at the time, but now it's like a very common thing for LGBT history projects to do those sort of like pin drop sort of ideas. So my research was sort of adjacent to that, but it was sort of having people draw these maps. But then I sort of wanted to go in and do more of that. And when I was starting my PhD research, was going to sort of follow that thread more, specifically looking at trans people. But then after I'd started my PhD, there was this massive influx of LGBTQ museum exhibitions because 2017 was the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalization of homosexuality in England and Wales. And all of a sudden, every museum had something. And for many of them, it was the first time that they had trans stuff on purpose. And I thought, I have to record this, I have to get it down, and I have to sort of try to reflect on this as it's happening, because whatever happens in this sort of first push is going to set the table for how it happens moving forward. And also because they were temporary exhibits, I just wanted to record them as best I could. So like now anyone can go into my appendices of my PhD and find, you know, what was in these exhibitions. So yeah, so that was sort of how I got into where I am now. Yeah.
So like, just that's really interesting. I think like just following on from that, what has, before we jump into the actual history that we're going to be chatting, what has your experience been as queer historians working, you know, within academia and within heritage circles? And so Lois, do you want to start now?
Yeah, so I think really similar to what Emma was saying, actually, of trying to sort of find myself. I think that really turning to history for me was a way to try to locate myself. And I think especially as like a non-binary person, like the visibility for trans people and for non-binary people has been so explosive over the past couple of years, but like even the language of it wasn't particularly accessible to me. So I think I was really looking for people who resembled me and who could give me a language to describe myself. So I think that's been a really wonderful thing, of to sort of like situate myself into a lineage. And also it's just been a really great way to find community. I mean, when you start researching like trans history, you get to know all the other trans historians, or they're just LGBT people. I mean, I know if a pandemic was on, Emma and I, I'm sure would have seen each other and all sorts of stuff already this year. Yeah, and but on the flip side, sometimes it's a bit frustrating. So just as an example, there was a bit where I was writing my PhD and I was writing about the history of medicalization of trans people. So I was reading all of these medical texts from like the late 1800s and early 1900s about discussing how sort of doctors were dealing with trans people, and at the same time was dealing with my GP and trying to get referrals to gender clinics and like trying to get on hormones and stuff, and dealing with that, and then turning back to and being like, all right, we're gonna put that aside, go to my work, and be like, oh, it's just the same stuff but 150 years ago, and being so frustrated. So that's not been as fun, but also you give me a bit of a something to argue with my GP about as well, you know. Yeah,
we like that, taking on the establishment.
yeah, exactly. She'd say something like, it's interesting you say that, because they were saying that then too.
Emma, do you want to chat about your experience now?
Yeah, sure. So I was employed as I got my job at John Moores as a public historian, and I wasn't even meant to be interviewed, but they had it was an all-male shortlist, and then they were like, yeah, I haven't got any women on there, so we need to put one in. So I was the token kind of I was the token woman, and I got the job. I was like, yeah. So I'm supposed to be employed as a public historian, and I do a lot of public history, but I came from an environment at the University of Reading where I had a a queer head of program, and it was all really like supportive, and so I came to John Moores and I was determined that I was going to like really quickly queer their curriculum, and I didn't really give a shit, sorry for swearing, that it didn't necessarily,
swear all you like.
wait, okay, I didn't really care that it didn't necessarily fit with what they were doing, and it's meant that I've had to sort of establish a foothold in a curriculum that's really white, male, very politically driven in terms of history, sort of Nazi Germany all the way, and that means that I sometimes don't get huge amounts of students on my modules, but the ones that I do get are like wholly committed, which I really like. I've got 16 this year, and they're brilliant. They're coping so well with everything. But I think I've been lucky. So I contributed to a report by the Royal Historical Association, and a lot of the testimony contained within that from LGBT scholars, particularly trans and non-binary, it was awful. And I feel really lucky that I've got a supportive program leader and supportive colleagues who just let me get on with it. I would say that I'm siloed in that there isn't that sense of feed through into other modules in terms of kind of queer representation. So I am the only gay in the village, which has its benefits, but then also I just wish there were more of us, really, because I get all the queer kids coming to me going, you know, can you help me with this? And so it's lovely in a way, but and I'm supported, but I just wish there was a bit more representation in our program.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's in a sense like a product of obviously, you know, society as a whole, but also sort of academia and the sort of traditionally like the focuses that it's had. You know, I think as a historian, like certainly everybody talks about, you know, there are certain periods of history that we go over to no end, and we, you know, people never get tired often of talking about the Nazis, but there's never really a place in the mainstream for any kind of like gender or sexuality diversity. So I think people just naturally, well, not naturally, but you know, as a consequence of that, people sort of tend to sideline it, which is really heartbreaking. But no, I mean, leading on quite nicely from that, histories of sort of modern Britain, like histories of pretty much everywhere else, with some exceptions, of course. There are some sort of more queer histories, all too often erase LGBT people. How does your work in particular sort of seek to disrupt that trend?
I think I've always sought to do my best to disrupt it, really. So I unapologetically do recovery history. Now, recovery history is not cool with most historians, because they'd say, oh, you shouldn't be trying to fill gaps. It's not as simple as doing that. It's noticing where you don't see the representation or the coverage, or however you want to put it, and thinking consciously, I want to do something about that for those kids that don't see themselves, or for those kids that want a more nuanced interpretation than just some white male cis historian going, you know, look at what I've written. So I'm all about recovery history, throwing light on narratives that don't necessarily fit with national collective memory. So I did that in the book that I wrote, Queen and Country, which got me into a massive amount of shit with the Sun and the Sunday Sport. Because they
like a badge of honor, that
it is a badge of honor, actually. Because they were like, what are you trying to say, queer people served in the British Army? I was like, yeah, they did actually. And they were like, no. And I was like, yeah. And at the time it was horrifying, because it like outed me and it was really bad, but now it is like a badge of honor. So I show my students every year, look at what happens when you try and tell stories that go against the grain, which I think is something that Corinne Fowler at Leicester's coming up against at the moment in her colonial countryside project. So I feel like this affinity to Corinne, because she's got this awful message on her out of office that just says this email is being monitored by the police, and I just think, my God, you've had some shit thrown your way. So yeah, I try and ruffle feathers basically and see what happens, because I can see no point in doing anything else. You may as well step back and step down if you're not prepared to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly like in academic circles, which, because it is, you know, academia is such a privileged, you know, in terms of like statistically, it's such a white male cis environment often. Certainly white, or pretty much unanimously.
Yeah.
That it you know, it tends to, I think, attracts, or it has at least, you know, in the past always tended to attract sort of very kind of small c conservative people. I think up until recently, I think there's been a bit of a breakthrough, but of course it tends to be allyship rather than sort of coming from those communities often. So I think that's really important. So Lois, what would you like to add anything or about your work?
Yeah, so I obviously a lot of my research was sort of looking at how you know, other places were approaching history and analyzing that. But I think one of the big things for me is about trying to open up how we look at history, particularly around gender diversity. And this is something that, you know, featured in my research, but I have had, I don't know how many arguments about within my department, because like I said, I come from an archaeology background, and which is a field that I don't think necessarily puts much thought or enough thought into what we carry in from the present about gender into the past. So you know, I had you know, somebody say to me, well, like, isn't doing trans archaeology just trying to push, you know, the idea of transness onto the past? And I was trying to say, well, no, it's not. It's about saying you know, letting people from the past tell us who they were, and instead of, you know, going to an ancient site and going, okay, where's the men and where's the women, just looking to see what's there. And first of all, saying, is there an idea of gender that is even emerging from what we can find in the material record? And if there is, what does that look like, without, you know, carrying the stuff in? You know, it's so much more embedded than we would like to think. The person who sat at the desk next to mine doing the PhD, her work was all about ancient Cypriot burials, and you know, she was looking at, you know, oh, these burials have spears, there must be men sort of idea, and not just breaking down that, hey, maybe that's not true, but she was doing all this analysis to say, hey, some of these spears were used and some of them weren't. So if we're going to look about, you know, symbolism of gender, we need to be looking at more than just presence of objects, but use of objects, and what that can tell us about the ways that society broke down in more ways than gender also, because maybe they didn't care. So a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is about saying, okay, let's not even start from idea of labeling a gender, but just like, let's let the past speak to us about what that diversity might look like.
Definitely. And I think there's like definitely like an assumption to there's a tendency to assume that like our normative ideas of, like, you know, gender and sexuality have kind of must have historical bases because they are, you know, because they're normative. No, but it's sort of,
sorry, while I'm thinking of it as well, I want to say another thing that happens, and I think we get picked up on in archaeology, is that they go, oh, we've identified these bones as male and these bones as female, and therefore men did this and women did this, which is just mixing up sex and gender and just flipping back and forth. And I think that's another thing of going like, hey, maybe let's not do that. Yeah.
No, definitely, because it just reminded me of it was a tweet I saw from like a quite a well-known like sexual historian called Kate Lister, who's recently released a really good book. Everyone should go and not sponsored, but definitely go and buy it. Curious History of Sex. It's very good. Where she was talking about the fact that she had a student come to see her who learned about who's reading the book Fanny and Stella, which is a Victorian book, for those of you who don't know, about two trans women, and they found the student found representation in that, and then, you know, felt comfortable enough to come out to their friends and started sort of cross-dressing, like but without, you know, without sort of labeling themselves as anything. I think, you know, that's kind of just bringing it back to some of the earlier questions, is that building in that kind of like hammering those kind of assumptions away and saying that no, people like us have always existed is, I think, really important on a personal level, not just, you know, just for the sake of academia, but for those studying it. It has real sort of personal significance. So just sort of moving on to the next set question we've got. So of course, as a political society, we're really interested in the way that politics has always interacted with ideas of sexuality and gender and with queer people, or just interacted with the idea of non-normative relationships generally. What is the relationship between sort of different aspects of the queer community and the British state been like historically?
If it's okay with you, I'm going to immediately deviate from just talking about the British state, because I know that
That's fun.
we're a society here, and I really wanted to talk about Leslie Feinberg, who is just an absolute icon, and wrote Stone Butch Blues and also Transgender Liberation, which I was recently reading and just kicking myself that I didn't read earlier, because it's came out in the late 90s, and it is a really, really incredible introduction to trans history if anybody is looking for one. But Feinberg, who used neopronouns, by the way, so if you hear pronouns that you aren't familiar with, that's why, wrote about the experience of being trans and the experience being butch, but was also a communist and believed very, very strongly in workers' rights. And one of the through lines in Transgender Warriors is how gender and by extension sexuality have been increasingly policed and regulated through time as a way of controlling labor, and about how the way to reach trans liberation or queer liberation is through robust support of workers' rights. So they talk about how like in the 1950s, butch lesbians would all tell each other to get trade jobs because those were union. And if you had a union job, then you couldn't get fired for wearing, quote, men's trousers. And so having those workers' rights meant that people had the stability to be able to live as themselves. So I've been thinking about that a lot recently, because I've involved in union stuff here in Manchester and through work, and about the ways that it's not just like inter LGBT support, but that we need and has worked historically, but sort of that cross support as well. And if you're interested in any of Feinberg's work, they sadly passed away 2014, but it's all available for free on her website. So that was part of the thing that Feinberg never wanted anyone to buy Stone Butch Blues and for someone else to profit off it. So if you're interested in that, and also Feinberg wrote so many essays about workers' rights and everything that's just available online. It's incredible. So I think that's a really a great example of the ways that sort of histories of gender and sexuality match with political histories.
But thank you. That's really it's really fascinating to hear, because I think it's one of the things, particularly with gender and gender diversity, more so, I mean, a bit more so than sexuality, that you don't really see discussed often within sort of school history books or within sort of academia at a higher level. People, I think largely because of things like the film Pride, with like LGSM. There's beginnings like that. There's like the beginnings of discussions around like sexuality and how that related with sort of the labour movement. But I think often it's completely sort of cis washed, if that's a word, in terms of ideas of gender. I mean, have you got anything else you'd like to add to that about sort of the state with queer people, or do you want to pass it on?
No, I kind of wrote on my notes that the relationship that the state has had with the queer community is appalling and continues to be appalling. That we've been at the mercy of state brutality since I went back to Henry VIII, but I think it's much earlier than that, in terms of that's when the sodomy law came in. I was teaching, or facilitating, should I say, with my students about the Labouchere Amendment and the fact that was brought in 1885 to criminalise gross indecency, and it actually happens because two political rivals decide that they're going to have a public ding-dong and someone's going to put in a breaker clause onto another piece of legislation, and it actually goes through as this ridiculously sort of opaque piece of law that then criminalizes male sexual activity, you know, right up until 67. So, and then you get to 67 and it's no better, and it's a piece of legislation handed down by people who think that queer men should be pitied. And then push it forward, you know, women have been invisible in terms of the law, in terms of criminalizing same-sex activity, but they've also been under the same structures as straight women in terms of, you know, patriarchal, the patriarchal system. And then if you get to non-binary and the trans community, that's like the final frontier at the moment. Like, what's up? Like, what, like, seriously, man, I'm beyond it. I'm beyond the TERFs. I can't engage, I very rarely engage with that stuff because I just don't get it. But I don't think the state is necessarily supporting the trans or non-binary or intersex communities to actually assert their right to live as they wish, to live as they want. And that's really galling. So yeah, I see the state as inherently unfair. I see it as a weapon. I see no good in the state.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely like a very fair sort of summary. I mean, certainly, so my dissertation focused on like the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 67. When of course there was like a huge, after that was passed, there was a huge increase in arrests and sort of the severity of those sentences and things. And so I think there needs to be you know, not that it's a hugely well known about sort of aspect of our history, but I think there needs to be kind of a public revision of that, where we counter the idea that sort of, you know, there was this kind of huge liberational moment, and yeah, things got a bit tough under Thatcher and those on the right, but eventually it all came good. I think there needs to be a rewriting of that. And that's really central to understanding where we are with so many things. Obviously, you know, with race, it's something that also, or you know, race, it's something that also needs to be a revision of. So yeah, just to go on to our final question before we go on to the Q&A section at the end. We often talk about learning from history to sort of better inform the decisions that we're making today, either as individuals or, you know, as politicians. What episodes in Britain's LGBT history should we look to inform how we're thinking about the current issues that are facing the community or different sections of the community? It's a tricky one to end on, I know.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I at the moment am sort of so like overwhelmed by the anti-trans stuff that's going on that it feels like the work has almost gone backwards. Like we're into this like survivalist, like just trying to be visible sort of situation, that I think it means that we don't have the space to have conversations about how to like move forward and how to like improve things, because we're back to just trying to like keep a seat at the table and to like let anything slip. So I think, you know, sort of as I mentioned, those sort of instances of intergroup solidarity, I think, is where we really need to be pulling from. And there are some days where I'm like where are like the lesbian Avengers? Like why aren't we parasailing off Parliament? You know, like it feels like that's what it's gonna have to take at this point. It seemed like we were doing it politely, you know. If you read through books like Trans Britain, which was edited by Christine Burns, and there's all these chapters about, you know, people meeting with MPs and press for changes, sort of legal battles in order to you know, get protections for trans people, sort of like this very like polite way, and going through like the proper legal channels, and I'm sort of like, okay, well, that they're not letting us do that anymore. Like nobody's taking meetings with us. No, just saying trans feels so political. So I'm wondering if maybe we should be looking to some of those sort of more those louder interventions.
Yeah, I think deference hasn't got us very far, has it? I think post-pandemic, there needs to be a million people, a million people sort of dropping themselves off of into the Houses of Parliament. But no, Emma, do you have anything else you wanted to add to that, or Lois, have you finished your point? Do you have something else to add?
Oh yeah, go.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I couldn't really like pull on a huge amount in terms of lessons that we can kind of look back on and pine for a better time. But I think it's been mentioned already, but the lesbian and gay support the minors. Let's get back to, you know, mutual support and funding and that kind of spirit of just togetherness to deal with something. Why can't we have that in terms of what's currently happening with the attacks on the trans community? Where's that gone? I feel like when you attempt to, just in social media, I find it really stifling, but if you attempt to show any kind of solidarity with the trans community as a non-trans person, you're piled upon. And so I can only imagine what it's like for the trans community to be trialed upon, to be pounced on by the TERFs. It's endlessly suffocating. So I would like to see a movement where the LGBT community comes together in order to, and also the straight community comes together and actually decides to put these TERFs down, starts to challenge people. So let's stop this kind of ridiculous bystander approach that we have to the rights of human beings. Let's get it right. The human beings, that's the common denominator, you know.
Massively. I think we're not going to be kind of winning these arguments, so to speak, on kind of intellectual terms, because not because the intellectual arguments aren't there, but just because that's not how you win most people over. It's with kind of a hearts and minds, with the emphasis on the hearts sort of thing. So we've got just to kind of lead on to the second half of this, we've got a couple of questions already sent in. So Casper asked to both of you, what are your favourite parts of LGBT history to teach people about and talk about? Which is a very wholesome question, I have to say.
It's
good for the soul.
Wholesome,
yeah. You've got to break up the doom and gloom somehow. So.
Do you want to go, Lois?
I mean, I think that that's a question for me that I think changes based on what I've been reading about. Yeah. But I think my favorites are sort of talking about people that, you know, particularly people that I relate to. So like I love talking about Gluck, who is a painter who just went by the name Gluck and refused any sort of title or gender marker or any other name. And like there's a story about Gluck where the painter had some paintings at a gallery, and then when the gallery sent the paintings back, they addressed it to Gluck's birth name, and Gluck sent the paintings back and was like, that person doesn't live here, I don't know who that is. which is I love that. And you know, one of the other ones that I've been really loving is you know, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who were artists and photographers, and described their gender as neuter, and also you know, spread anti-Nazi pamphlets around the I think it was Isle of Jersey, and just were very like anti-Nazi art. It's great. And if you've not seen their photographs, I definitely recommend looking them up, because they're so cool and like modern, and they don't seem as old as they are, the photos. So I think just talking about people is like my favorite thing.
Yeah, I love that. Bash the cash bit in like entirely rainbow.
Yeah.
That's what I'm picturing right now. Do you want to go
Yeah.
with yours?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's kind of so much. Next week I'm leading sessions on Maud Allan, and I really love talking about Maud Allan. I've got my pug is named after Maud Allan because she's this subversive, erotic dancer who dances the dance of Salome, which obviously has links to Oscar Wilde, and then is accused of being a lesbian and then instigates a libel trial and comes off really badly, but she's supposedly having this affair with Asquith's wife. And I love the kind of, I love the scandal of it, and the kind of assessing the impact and who knew what, which is a question Laura Doan like posits all the time, but she's like, how do we know what and when and how, and how do we know what people thought? And I'm constantly saying that to my students, what was the impact of this event on shaping consciousness of queer people and queer communities? And so Maud Allan's a really interesting case study. I also like doing stuff on the Sexual Offences Act, I think, just because I really like to push home the idea that this is not all roses, and to just look at the motivations of the politicians that push it through and why they push it through, and this construction of the queer man who can have no family and is desperately unhappy, and therefore the kindest thing to do is to give him some foothold in normality by allowing him to kind of express his desires behind closed doors. It's just, I like my students to kind of interrogate that a bit, because otherwise they come away thinking that 67 is this radical watershed when it isn't. So
yeah, definitely, like behind closed doors, preferably padlocked kind of
and just
thing,
the two of you.
Yeah. No, just for those of you who I know we have lots of like non-historians who are watching at the moment. Within the 67 Sexual Offences Act, it was stipulated that two men could have sex in private, and in private was defined as being it didn't apply to hotel rooms or anything, and it couldn't be in a residence where other people lived. So unless you like owned your own flat or renting your own flat or house, so unless you were kind of upper middle class or upper working class, or middle class, you were fucked. Ironically. You're fucked, you can be fucked. We have got a couple of other proper questions, but just Patricia, George and Callum have asked, Lois, can you repeat the names of the photographers, please?
Oh yeah, so those are Claude Cahoon and Marcel Moore.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you for that.
I can put it in the chat actually, so you can see the spelling.
Yeah, that might be helpful in terms of spelling. But no, just to keep things moving on. So the next question from Chris is, first, thank you for such a great talk. Leading on from the discussion around the state, I was wondering if either of you could address the ways in which immigration and or refugee policy relating to normative ideas of family impact LGBT people and communities. Big question.
Yeah, it is. I've got a colleague, I'm part of the Oral History Society.
So I
go on.
If you want to start, I can talk about this a little bit. I've been trying to because sorry, I've frozen a little bit.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I was going to say that this is something that sort of I've been dealing with, because if you can't tell, I'm not from here. And so I'm currently constantly dealing with visa issues. And so this is something that's often on my mind. And I think, I mean, there's lots of people who talk about refugees, and I can't really speak to that from a personal experience, but a lot of the ways that sort of immigration is set up is in this very cis heteronormative way. So I mean, you do see it in people making refugee applications, where there's this like judgment of who is gay enough to be able to claim asylum, and is very arbitrary and often is ignorant of things that people have been through. So if somebody was sort of, for example, like forced or coerced, say, into a heterosexual marriage, and then comes here and tries to claim asylum because they're queer, then that is often used against them, that they were in this heterosexual marriage. It doesn't actually take into account if that's a marriage that they wanted to be in. And I think also is that whole policy is so it's this like legacy of imperialism of like, oh, we'll save you from these backwards anti-LGBT stuff. And so we can feel really good about ourselves that we're letting these LGBT people in, never mind that it's, you know, not great here on many days, especially if you're trans. But also, you know, even from non-refugee, just sort of looking at immigration, this cis heteronormativity is so baked into it. I mean, it's increasingly harder, for example, to get work visas here. And so one of the ways to secure or to have, you know, secure living is to get married, right? And it's this holding up of marriage as this thing that is what is going to allow you to come in. And I mean, the laws that get around, for example, trans people marrying are very funny and dubious, and actually for non-binary people is very difficult. So in this country, you can have same-sex marriages, obviously, and different sex marriages, but you have to be either a husband or a wife, right? So the marriage certificate says you can have 2 wives and you can have 2 husbands, but you can't just be a spouse. Now, of course, you could then, you know, have a civil partnership, say, but like some countries don't respect that as much. And so you're sort of, if you're looking at an international thing, you're going to have to go the marriage route, and it's just very complicated. And so yeah, so that is my personal experience right now, is trying to navigate that. But it's this this expectation that the sort of most valid way to stay here is to engage in heterosexual marriage. So
yeah, we are encouraging people to behave in normative ways in order to pass our ridiculous benchmarks to stick around. And yeah, I'm not going to speak from experience, but I am going to share the fact that a colleague of mine she's about to publish a book. So her name is Jane Trays, and she's written a book, Refugee Stories from the Lesbian Immigration Support Group. And it's just a collection of narratives by lesbians who have been seeking asylum in Brighton and the surrounding area. So I don't think it's out just yet, but it will be. But I think from memory, she's probably one of the first people to actually to do anything in relation to the stories of refugees. So yeah, that would be worth having a look at. It's Chris, isn't it? Yes, it'd be worth having a look at, Chris, if you're interested.
Yeah, I know that Becky Taylor at UEA does an awful lot of stuff on refugee things, but I don't believe she's ever done anything specifically in relation to LGBT history, kind of intersectionality with refugees. But it just question just reminded me of under when Theresa May was Home Secretary, that lots of LGBT people who were fleeing asylum were essentially made to film themselves having sex and send it to the Home Office to so that they'd be granted their asylum seeker status, so they could avoid then being sent back to Iran or wherever it is to their deaths, which I think really speaks to the extent to which the British state, even really now has utter contempt for LGBT people.
Yeah.
Which is, I've just lost where I am now. There we go. From Emily, she's asked, firstly, thank you for a genuinely really interesting talk. Any recommendations for accessible texts or other ways to learn about queer history for a non-historian?
A Gay History of Britain's not too bad. So that covers a big historical period. You could go for that one. A Trans History of Britain.
Yeah. I was going to say that. Great one.
Yeah. That's also good. Susan Stryker has written a good history of the trans community in America. So you could go for that as well. That's really accessible. And actually rewrites what we know about events like Stonewall. So Susan Stryker's done some work on the Crompton cafeteria riots and how that predates Stonewall. So I would be going for her history of the trans community in America, if that's your bag.
Lois, got anything to add to that?
I mentioned earlier the Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors. I also think if you're a non-historian and maybe don't want to read, that podcasts are an incredible place for LGBT history. There's so many that I love. There's but just off the top of my head, there's Making Gay History, which uses audio recordings from interviews with people. It's mainly US based, but like really fascinating. And then there's a couple emerging ones, but there's one called The Logbooks, which is specifically about
Lois, I was just going to say that one.
Yeah, it's so good. And uses stories from people calling LGBT helpline in the 70s and 80s. That one is really fascinating. And then there's other ones. There's a Sappho one that I just started listening to called Sweet Bitter, which is just about the history of Sappho. So especially if podcasts are, there are so many LGBT history podcasts, I'd say definitely give that a look.
Yeah, the gays are taking over the airwaves. Just to add on to that, it's not so much, it's partially historical at the beginning, and then it goes into kind of a contemporary commentary. But Matthew Todd's Straight Jacket, How to Be Gay and Be Happy, is also quite good. And I think the first chapter or two has kind of a sort of follows British gay history from like on a very human level up until sort of the current moment. So that's also quite good if you fancy something that has sort of mixed historical stuff and contemporary stuff. So going down, so I think that may be it for our questions. Has anybody else got anything they want to add in? Quickly add it into the chat, or oh, sorry, Caitlin, I think I've missed yours. There are many historical figures that are suspected to be queer in some way, from letters, correspondences, or historical accounts, but are not classed as queer in most historiography, as there is a lack of quote-unquote proof of sexual relationship or specific gender identity. Do you think the pressure to find proof of queer relationships and identities of the past will sorry, my scrolling's not doing very well. Do you think the pressure to find proof will change, or do you think this will continue to be an obstacle in the history of queer people?
I think it's changing. So this idea of proof, I think if you're going to be a historian of sexuality and gender, then you need to acknowledge that there are going to be absences in the evidence that you need to use to your advantage and speculate around, as opposed to see them as gaps. So I think there's already a bit of a turn towards, should I say, of acknowledging that the proof doesn't necessarily exist, but that then shouldn't result in, I don't know how best to express it really. Lois, do you want to take over? I think what I'm trying to say is that the absence of proof is not an issue. That there's only so much proof that one can get when you're dealing with actors from past epochs, where you're trying to deal with them in a context-specific way to root their sense of self and understanding in the context of the time and how much they knew and how much they could apply the understanding of wider culture and society to themselves. and it's trying to find the truth of their identity and self-expression in the maybe small fragments that you have, as opposed to looking for absolutely 100% watertight sort of evidence, which I don't think, can we say that we have that on anybody? I was teaching Oscar Wilde today, and you know, trying to convey to my students that this is somebody who would be spinning in his grave in Paris if he knew that he'd been held up as an icon by the LGBT community. Do you know what I mean? So, and the evidence of his activity is pretty clear, but then equally, it would be remiss of us to label him as anything other than somebody that was having sex with other men. I got there in the end.
I think as well, one of the things is that like oftentimes what is like accepted as proof is this like there's this tinge that it like has to be sexual. And I think that there's this thing that like we're starting to maybe move away from that, and sort of make space first of all, what do relationships have to be sexual for them to be valid? Like, so what if we don't know for sure if the ladies of Langdalen were doing it, you know, like they were living together, and also they named their dog Sappho. I think, you know,
totally were.
Yeah, I mean, they were, but we don't need a diary.
Yeah, we don't need to know, do we? It's fine.
Suddenly naming my dog Snoopy seems like such a bad idea.
I recently actually read this book called Asexual Erotics, which is sort of about asexuality. It is a really phenomenal book. It came out, I think, in the last year or so. But the author, who had first name Ila, second name is, I think, in a language I cannot pronounce. It's like a Polish name, and I've never heard it out loud, so I don't actually know how to pronounce it, but is a phenomenal book. And in it, she talks about that, you know, she talks about lesbian history, and sort of saying, like, are relationships less valid if they were not sexual, and do we need that history, and actually what does it look like as well to not sort of carry normative ideas of what even sexuality looks like into past, not just in terms of who people are loving, but what people are doing with their bodies and what they're doing with other people. And that our expectations of what a relationship looks like, even on that level, is maybe something we should be critical about in what we're looking for in historical evidence. And so I think that any shift to what is considered needed and how we looked at history is going to come from what we consider to be validating about relationships in the present. And so as discussions happen in the present about what relationships looks like, I think that's what's going to impact what we accept as evidence.
Definitely, I think that's a really important point to make, also in terms of like LGBT plus history. You know, people often forget the plus in terms of like including aromantic or asexual people, and sort of, you know, realizing that relationships obviously will have looked different historically, just like they do now. So I believe that is now the end of all of the Q&A questions. So I believe we're pretty much finished. I'll let everybody go off and have their dinners or whatever it is they're going to do with their evening. I would say go down the pub, but obviously lockdown. Sorry, not my fault. Blame Bojo. Hopefully in a couple of months we can all go down the pub together. We can do these events in person, and then we'll be off to the bar. But no, thank you so much to everybody for coming, and of course to our two genuinely brilliant guests. I think this has been probably one of the most sort of like insightful events we've had. It was genuinely been brilliant to have you guys. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the invite, and thanks for the really insightful questions, you guys. It's very good.
Yeah, it's been really, really interesting, and yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Thank you so much for that. I will now let you all go free.
Thanks so much for organising.
Yeah, have a good evening.
Problem.
Yeah, have a good evening.
Yeah. Also, happy LGBT History Month quiz. We love it.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye.